Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Thursday, October 30th, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Deborah Fairlamb, a co-founding partner at Green Flag Ventures. Green Flag Ventures is a venture capital firm focused on tech products in Ukraine, and in particular on the MilTech, military technology area. Welcome, Deborah. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us today, despite some challenging situations there in Kyiv.
Yeah, we had a little bit of an electricity shuffle this morning. And so thank you for bearing with me as we went ahead and recorded this when we had, electricity. So thank you.
So to start off with, can you give us some information on your educational and professional background?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So as you can tell by my accent, I am American, had grown up, gone to university in the United States, and had spent several years working in financial services in New York before eventually coming to Ukraine. I had come from Merrill Lynch and UBS, so it was the private wealth management area. And when I moved to Ukraine in 2007, I was able to take that background and those skills and sort of apply it and find new places for it in the developing economy that was going on in Ukraine back in 2007.
And why did you first go to Ukraine in 1999? You've been involved in investments and business development in Ukraine for more than 10 years now. Can you describe a few of the projects you worked on, including the Ukrainian National Startup Fund?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So actually, my path to Ukraine was marriage to a Ukrainian. We had met in New York back in the late 90s and gotten married. And so the first time I had come to Ukraine in 1999 with him was to visit family who were here. And at that point, it was just an initial visit. That was almost 8 years before we actually moved here. But I sort of am able to benchmark Ukraine's growth and trajectory sort of from that point up until where we are now. When we moved to Ukraine, as I mentioned, I was sort of able to take some of the skills in investing. And a lot of the things that I have done here really have sort of been at the intersection of business development and investments and helping projects find investors or helping investors find projects. I had done some work in FDI, which is foreign direct investment, and that's usually much larger investments into Ukraine. That includes things like new manufacturing facilities, big warehousing, things like that. But I really had sort of segued over to the developing tech sector back in, it was really around 2017, 2018. I had been working as an advisor for Oksana Makarova. While I was working for Oksana, there were really two projects. One initially was the one around foreign direct investment, and that was with the agency that's now called Ukraine Invest. And then the second project was around an idea that the government of Ukraine had about really wanting to support the developing just broad tech ecosystem here in Ukraine at the time. So I was tasked with sort of helping to put together the structure and ideas of what eventually became the Ukrainian Startup Fund. And while I was doing that, it was looking at how the government could take money, put it into grants into the tech ecosystem. And of course, there was a lot of different pieces around that. One was, how do you make sure that you are responsibly putting money that is taxpayers' money out into the ecosystem where it'll make a change? You also want to understand the needs from the tech developer side. And so that was when I really sort of got to know the tech ecosystem more broadly. And then the last piece was just making it attractive for other, hopefully foreign investors to invest in this Ukrainian tech, as a follow-on after the government of Ukraine had used the startup fund to really put forth a show of faith in terms of some of the growth of these companies in the ecosystem. So that was the segue for me between doing consulting, with the government, but also then more directly into the emerging tech ecosystem at the time.
Deborah, why did you decide to establish Green Flag Ventures in 2023 with a partner? What is the mission of the venture fund, and what are some of its current investments?
Yeah. So since having that experience initially with the tech ecosystem in back in 2017, 18, 19, I really had this extraordinary position of watching this ecosystem grow as there were new accelerators that were developed. There was just the sheer number of startups really continued to grow. So I was very confident in the capabilities of the Ukrainian founders that we were seeing and in their capacity to build really unique and important products. Now, when you fast forward to 2022 with the Russian invasion, the thing that has happened here that is maybe not completely obvious to the outside, but this whole new defense tech ecosystem that has sort of grown from the ground up really was the result of the extraordinary talent of the tech ecosystem that had existed pre-war. Now, before the war, these were founders who were building fintech platforms, crowdsourcing platforms, B2B SaaS, kind of the very traditional range of tech products. But what they did was essentially have pivoted to start this whole new ecosystem of products that are being used and developed in conjunction with Ukrainian soldiers to help them defend Ukraine. So having been in Ukraine and sort of watching all of this happen, for me, it was an incredibly clear and obvious compelling case, both in terms of one of the things that really there's traditionally been two things that the tech ecosystem in Ukraine has been missing. One is just access to capital. There are not the private markets. There's not as much free flow of capital here as there is in the West. So capital has always been a constraint. And then the other thing was very often connections to the West. And so when I met my business partner, Justin Zief, who is my co-founder, and he also had the opportunity to see the Ukrainian tech ecosystem actually post the invasion. And he came to the exact same conclusion that I did, that this was an ecosystem that was developing an extraordinary new sector of products that were being used out on the battlefield with compelling use cases, with efficiency and effectiveness. They were being mass produced here in Ukraine. And so both of us really saw this as an opportunity by setting up a fund to do two things simultaneously. So one, it was to support these tech companies in Ukraine that are contributing to the soldiers' ability out on the front every single day. But these are also companies that are building products that have applicability and business cases outside of Ukraine in the longer term. So we do not look at this as a philanthropic fund. We absolutely fully look at this in terms of the business case of both helping these companies grow now in Ukraine, but also very firmly believing that they have a market to enter outside of Ukraine whenever this phase of the war ends.
And why has Ukraine become a key player in the development of drones for military purposes? And can you give us some examples of this?
Yeah, of course. So in the context of what is happening here, really, this war is extremely different from any war that has been fought elsewhere. And it's very hard for people to understand from the outside. But the rise of drones in particular, which is the thing that people are most familiar with, really sort of had come about as the Ukrainians being extremely resourceful in filling gaps, especially early in the war, when Ukraine was waiting for assistance from partner nations. It wasn't like the Ukrainians could just say to the Russians, hang on, we're waiting for the next shipment of arms to come in. Really, the Ukrainians were being extremely creative in using anything and everything that they could to understand. And so One of the first use cases was just using drones. And in fact, they called them wedding drones, which to some degree they were, just the Mavics, for intelligence gathering, surveillance, reconnaissance, just for Ukrainian troops to understand what was happening. And the use of drones in that ISR capacity proved to be so helpful that the Ukrainians started looking at other ways that they could use drones. And so it's really kind of morphed from one use case to the next. And with each use case, these drones are being iterated. They are growing more sophisticated. There are more use cases they're being adapted to. And so when you talk about the literally millions of drones in Ukraine, it spans a wide range of kinds of drones. So there are really small, tiny ones that are not much bigger than your fist, all the way up to very large fixed wing drones that can now fly thousands of kilometers deep into Russia as strike drones. And all of this is being used for Ukraine, both in its defense, but also now and more for striking deep within Russia in the context of taking out the oil refineries, strategic military targets, and things like that. I think another piece that's really important, and I'll just slide this in, is that the Ukrainians are not doing this in a vacuum. The Russians have, there's two things. So one, the Russians are absolutely innovating, though not as quickly and not sort of as smartly as the Ukrainians are. But one of the things that the Russians are doing that has proved to be a challenge and also a driver of a lot of the innovation is the incredibly heavy use of electronic warfare, GPS denial, all of these things that most Western kit, and in fact, many things in the West, rely upon for being able to communicate either point to point with radio communication or pinging off of satellites. Out on the front, GPS does not exist for about a 20-kilometer zone, sometimes even further. And it's true for the radio capacity as well. And so what that means is the Ukrainians have really had to innovate in the context of not just building the drone bodies, but it's creating the software and the sensors and the cameras and all of these new ways of being able to fly these drones in extremely heavily electronic magnetic warfare situation, or just complete GPS denial. So as much as the Ukrainians are innovating, it's generally been in response to things that the Russians continue to sort of respond with. And so that is really one of the reasons that you're seeing this mass iteration and this growth of the technology and the importance of data and all of these things that are happening here. All of these are extremely pertinent to the West, because even though I know that it's sometimes hard for people to understand, and quite frankly, I talk to people in Western militaries, and it's truly hard for them sometimes to wrap their brains around in terms of this new type of fighting, the heavy electronic warfare environment, the GPS denied environment, and that it really has changed these tools of defense and offense. And so looking forward, Ukraine is far and away the best prepared of a Western nation for understanding how this kind of fight needs to be fought, for being able to teach lessons learned, and that's on so many levels, to the West, because quite frankly, the Russians are going to fight like this going forward. The Chinese, the North Koreans are all going to use these very new tactics of war, these new tools of war, for future conflicts. And the West really needs to be ready for this kind of war that their enemies are going to fight, not particularly the kind of war that they had been prepared for back, when they were either in Afghanistan or Iraq, or even earlier back to say World War II.
Deborah, we're just about out of time, but I do want to ask you a final question. Are there any major U.S. companies interested in investing in Ukraine's defense tech industry? And if there are, can you give some examples?
Yeah. So I have to say there had been, what you had mentioned earlier, we launched the fund back in October of 2023. And in a lot of our initial conversations, as we were going out raising money, that, from people in the West to be able for our fund that we would then turn around and invest here. There was a lot of skepticism. There was sort of a lack of knowledge and not really an awareness of this whole new defense tech ecosystem that was emerging. There are a number of things that have changed over the last, really particularly 6 months. And so we really have seen an uptick in terms of interest from the West. There is a huge amount of money being invested into US defense tech. I think the number last year topped more than $4 billion that went into emerging defense tech in the United States. And as a little comparison, Ukraine, which is the one who actually does have the most cutting edge, most tested equipment in the world, really attracted less than $100 million total for investment. So there is still an enormous opportunity for people to be able to invest into this ecosystem. And like I said, the last 6 months really has seen a shift in terms of more investments coming to Ukraine, as well as, to your question, U.S. defense tech companies even looking. So Shield AI, which is one of the bigger U.S. newer defense tech companies, is actually, they've got offices here on the ground in Ukraine. And when they first sent their equipment over, it was not working the way they anticipated. And in some cases, it wasn't working at all, largely because of the Russians' use of electronic warfare. And to Shield AI's credit, they said, okay, we're going to stay in Ukraine and we're going to figure it out and we're going to work with the Ukrainian soldiers. And so that's what they've done. So Shield AI is a great example from the US, who really have understood the importance of being in Ukraine, working alongside both Ukrainian soldiers as well as the amazing tech ecosystem here, to really understand how this is growing and where it is going forward.
Deborah, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thank you so very much, Mike. I really appreciate you giving me the chance to talk and to help people understand a little bit more about what's going on here.
I have been speaking with Deborah Fairlamb, who is a co-founding partner at Green Flag Ventures, a venture capital firm focused on tech products in Ukraine, and in particular on the defense tech industry. This episode of Krynytsia was produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.